Historically, Canon haven't often added big new features to their cameras over firmware updates. They have occasionally, sure, but most of the time the camera stays pretty much as it is at launch for its lifespan, with maybe a few small tweaks here and there. The C70 has already been a huge exception to that. Back in March, we got one of the largest firmware updates I've ever known Canon to release when they added raw recording modes to the C70. Until then, the camera mainly recorded in long-op codecs, with regular 25 or 30p also being able to be recorded in AllI. So having raw options in camera was a big deal for the C70, and it really did elevate it as a cinema camera for a lot of people. And now we have another big firmware update. This one adds 3 big features which I want to test in this video, and a bunch of features which I'm just going to run through quite quickly here. The audio level displays now show 4 channels of audio rather than 2. We get their XC protocol support like their PTZ cameras, the XF605 and C300 and C500. So the C70 will work better in a multi-camera environment with Canon's different control options. And we get support now for their new cinema lenses like the Flex Zooms and the CN8 Cine Servo lens, which was launched at IBC. And all of those are useful to have, but the 3 big updates which we want to highlight in more detail are the addition of more AllI codecs, eye tracking in autofocus including in slow motion modes, and a new picture profile called Canon 709, which Canon say is an improved version of YDR, which is the picture profile I use most of the time on this channel, so I'm very curious about that one. Let's start with the simple one to test out though. Canon have expanded AllI support to go up to 4K 50 and 4K 60, and here are the data rates that it uses at each of those frame rates. For those that aren't familiar with AllI, it's going to give you larger file sizes than long-op modes, which the C70 currently uses, but it will be easier to edit once you get into post-production. The current firmware only lets you get to 25 or 30p when you're set to 4K AllI, and it's fixed at a data rate of 410 megabits a second for that. Now on the new firmware, when you select 4K AllI, you can choose 25 or 50p. And when you're in 25p, you also get the choice of scaling that original 410 megabits a second data rate down a bit, back down to 250 megabits a second, which is great. It's all the advantage of AllI, but with half the data rate. And we did a quick side-by-side test on the bookcase here in the showroom, and you can't really tell the difference at all on a still scene like this anyway. So it doesn't look like it impacts the image quality much at all, although admittedly we haven't tested it in a scene with lots of movement. So this really rounds out the recording options on the C70. The only real limitation remaining now is going to be in 4K 120, where you're not going to have access to RAW and you're not going to have access to AllI. You'll just have to use long-op or H.265 to be able to get up to that frame rate. The autofocus improvements though will be perhaps the update that I imagine people will be most pleased to see. On the left here is the current C70 firmware, and on the right is the new C70 firmware. And as you can see, we now get eye tracking just like on their mirrorless cameras. This is fantastic, and it's something we've been hoping Canon would add for a long time to the C70. As you can see here, it's tracking Kieran's eye really well. This is set to face priority, so it will move to the back of his head and his hand when he puts it up in front of his face. And both are doing a good job here. But let's now move to a different setup with Nathaniel, a more interview-based setup with the camera much further over to one side and moodier lighting as well. So this is a much more challenging situation for a camera to autofocus in because of several different aspects here. And both versions of the firmware do seem to have their own struggles with this test. So the new firmware seems to struggle to identify his eye, but it does reliably keep him in focus as he moves. While the current firmware does track his face the whole time, but it does hunt around quite a lot at the start of the clip and definitely here at the end. So the new firmware isn't perfect. There's still scope to improve things here further, but it's certainly a lot better, and the C70's autofocus was already very reliable. We use it all the time on this channel, so this is only going to make it better. The last big update here that we wanted to take a look at is the new Canon 709 color profile. Canon is describing this as an improvement over their classic YDR profile, which has been in their cameras for many years now and is the main profile we use on this channel. I'm using it right now. Although the original YDR is still in camera, so it's clearly not just a direct replacement for it. Canon say the main difference with this profile and YDR is that the new one doesn't use super wides like YDR does. So it's going to max out at 100 IRE rather than going up to 109 IRE, and this avoids a bit of clipping in the highlights. And if we look at it side by side with YDR, it does seem to be doing that slightly, but the difference is very subtle. For example, I've included the regular X709 profile here now, just for perspective on just quite how far we've come with both the YDR and the new Canon 709 profiles. They both look so much better. Look at how much extra highlight information there is. However, the highlight clipping doesn't seem to be the main difference between YDR and the new Canon 709. The shadows are significantly lower on Canon 709, which results in just a much more contrasty image overall. So YDR and Canon 709 definitely do have different looks to them. So that is the new firmware for the C70. It is fantastic to see Canon adding so many new features to a camera through firmware. The C70 has just transformed since it was first released. But what do you think of Canon's new update? Let us know in the comment section, and if you want to buy a C70 for yourself or anything else, of course, just head over to provi.co.uk. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.